Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 7 game from the St. Louis Norm Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I earned my first draw, my first points of the entire tournament in round 6 against Brandon Jacobson, and I must say it was a bit of a relief to get on the board, but it was still an abysmal tournament. I mean, half point out of 6 is just dreadful, and frankly, I was wanting the tournament to end as soon as possible, but I still had 3 games to go. And in this one, I was playing another tough opponent, a young international master named Brian Escalante Ramirez from Peru. He's actually one of these strong chess players that goes to school in the United States now, and he's, I believe at the time of the game, he was a freshman or perhaps a sophomore at Webster University, which, you know, has a very, very strong chess program and gives full ride scholarships to really talented chess players. So, you know, in these closed events, there are no easy games, and this was no different. Now, I was black, and, you know, I've kind of thrown a few different openings at the wall in this tournament, and was just trying to basically surprise, because I thought the element of surprise was most critical at this point, and especially considering now that I was on such a poor score, other opponents could pretty much consider that I was going to be an opponent that, you know, they could probably take points off of. So I was really trying to be especially cautious in my play, and you're going to see that in this game. Anyways, let's get on to it. So Brian went e4. I went e5. That's actually a rare choice for me. I had really played e5 to this point only a few times over the course of the year. In fact, maybe it was only once, because I think the only game I'd played e5 that I can distinctly remember from 2019 before this one was my win against Jordan Van Forest in the Reykjavik Open. So this might have been only the second time I played e5 this year, so I thought it'd be a surprise. And after knight f3, I actually played knight f6, and this I thought for sure would be the surprise, because the Petrov is certainly a rare guest in my opening repertoire. My idea was to play something again that he probably didn't spend much time looking at, and to really have the element of surprise. And there were several variations that I looked at where I thought, you know what, I could kind of hold my own in the Petrov. And Fabiano Caruana has maintained the Petrov in his repertoire quite well over the course of the past few years, and has really been quite difficult to beat there. So I thought, you know what, if it's good enough for Fabiano, it's good enough for me. The issue with the Petrov is that there are a lot of forcing lines in which black is okay, but he kind of has to know them to be able to hold the game. And so I did a whole lot of homework in the days before this game, trying to figure my way around these lines, and unfortunately I wasn't able to memorize everything. So the risk is when you play something that is not entirely in your normal repertoire, you're leaving yourself a little bit more exposed to ideas just because you're not familiar in the position as well. So whereas if you get surprised in opening that you know well, because you understand the structures and the general plans, it might be a little bit easier to navigate. So essentially I was hoping that Brian would run into a line I'd actually looked at, and that I'd get a position that I was comfortable with. Unfortunately, that did not happen, because after knight f6, Brian played d4. And d4 is probably, well, let's just say it's not the main move. Knight takes e5 is the main move. It's probably like the second or third choice. And okay, I looked at this line because it's the second or third choice. You have to at least have something on move 3. I mean, move 3 shouldn't surprise you. So I played knight takes e4, which is the normal move. But after bishop d3, d5, knight takes e5, and knight d7, I was still following theory, and so far so good. This is actually the way it's supposed to go. You get rid of this knight on e5 relatively quickly, and you kind of try to develop your pieces in castle. The tricky thing about this line is this knight on e4 sometimes becomes a little bit of a target, and so I try to, you know, justify it there, but it can be challenged quite quickly. And after knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, castles, bishop d6, and knight c3, this is the move that really threw me off, because it was not something I'd actually looked at. Now, this move is in fact theory and has been played quite a bit, but I just hadn't remembered the details of it. And the issue is it's quite a forcing line because it basically allows white to simplify the game and get like a risk-free position that's fairly symmetrical where black just kind of has to defend to hold. I say that because in other lines of the Petrov, like if I just back up for a little bit and go to the Nims, one of the lines that's really hot at the moment is knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, and knight c3. And this line is actually the Nimzovich defense. And in a lot of these lines, black winds up castling king side while white castles queen side. And in those lines, there's an imbalance that gives black some counterplay because while white's trying to attack black, if black manages to survive, normally there's weaknesses that happen as a consequence of pushing these pawns. Now, if you compare that to the line in the game, this particular line after knight c3, you can see that the position is relatively symmetrical and white's king is already castled. And so the imbalance that like I really was looking for to get counterplay is not really there in the same way. And so I think it's actually a really good choice if you're surprised because it's kind of almost a risk-free position for white. So I was not super happy with the fact that I'd have no real prospects for counterplay. I'd have to defend for an extended period of time. So anyways, after knight c3, my knight is challenged by the bishop and the knight. And the issue is that if I go back, then rook e1 challenges my king on e8 with check. So I decide to take on c3. And you might say, well, Kassa, isn't there an imbalance here? What about aren't these pawns doubled? Isn't that, bad structurally? Well, in theory it is, but the problem is in these positions, white can easily go c4 and undouble the pawns really quickly. And c4 is quite an annoying move because it's a lever to open up my center and potentially give the bishop an active diagonal to play on. So, yeah, even though those double pawns are doubled, it's not really as much of a weakness as you'd think. And it's actually an asset in the short term because it strengthens d4. So, again, I think the general consensus here is I was not pleased with this position because it's relatively symmetrical and white is just a little bit faster than black in terms of, development and really king safety. I'm now pretty much obliged to castle, and white pretty much has a few different ways to put the pressure on black. So after castling, queen h5 was played, and this is one of those ways that provokes a crisis right away. So the issue here is that queen takes h7 is mate, but also the d5 pawn is a target. And the issue is that in order to save yourself from mate and to save the d5 pawn, there's only one move that really does that, and it's a move that's extremely weakening, and it's the move which I played, f5. Now, of course, you'd love to not play f5, but that was the only way to save d5. And the issue here is that I've weakened the dark squares really, really significantly by pushing this pawn 2 squares. And actually, I've actually weakened 4 squares, right? Because if we talk about when you push a pawn 2 squares, you weaken 4 squares. You weaken the squares adjacent to the new square it's in, and you weaken squares diagonal to the square it was originally in. So those weaknesses are really kind of an issue because there's stuff I can't really cover again with pawns, in particular e5 and e6, and there are things that white could potentially take advantage of. So even though I've kind of thwarted this initial attack, it's just something that really I was not comfortable with, and I was very unhappy that I had to make this move. The other thing to keep in mind is that by pushing the f pawn, I also weaken my entire king side, and in particular the 7th rank. So as long as queens or rooks are on the board, my king is going to be very, very airy. And if you compare it with white's king, you can see white's king has nothing remotely around it to harass it. And already these bishops here are already, combining to, potentially do some damage against me. So really, really tough to play f5, but this is actually still theory and has been played before. It's just not a position I was familiar with. And so in every move, I'm kind of almost walking on eggshells trying to hold the game. After f5, white played rook e1. That's incredibly logical. Take advantage of the one open file, which is also even more of an asset given the fact that I can't block the file with a minor piece because my pawn is now in f5. So, yeah, good move. I went queen f6 now, trying to connect my rooks and challenge eventually on the e-file with rook e8. It's apparently, after I checked the database, it's apparently the second most popular move. The most popular move in this position is c6, and I'm going to assume because it's the most popular, it's the best move, but I can't be 100% sure. The point is, though, that even in this position after c6, which is the move that's played the most, white has a really, really pleasant position, even just with a move like bishop g5. And the point is that after the queen moves away, now c4 is played, and you could see that white just has a little bit more of an initiative. This pawn tension is unpleasant. If I recapture, the bishop comes to c4 and gets a really nice diagonal. And white's is already, again, controlling the open e-file, and he also has a half-open b-file for counterplay. And the fact that these pawns are split is not really as huge a deal as you'd think, because they give white all this counterplay and activity. So yeah, it's just not a very pleasant position, even if you know exactly what you're doing. And I think you can also safely say it's a 2 results game for white. And so what I mean by 2 results is like best case scenario, or worst case scenario for white, he's going to draw. Best case scenario is going to win, you know? So he's kind of not really playing with any risk, which is always a very pleasant thing, a situation to have. So anyways, after queen f6, white went queen f3. I think that's a reasonable move. My deal with queen f6 is that if bishop g5 was played, I was going to probably go queen f7, or actually maybe even queen g6. And the point is that a queen trade, it wouldn't be the end of the world for me. I actually wouldn't mind that, because it would kind of nullify some of the pressure on my king. Even in a position like bishop e7, where you'd say, oh, if you take here, isn't the rook getting very active on e7? Well, here I thought I might be able to get away with rook e8. Point being that these double pawns aren't as bad as they look, because black has targets on the c file based on the c3 pawn. So I could bring a rook to c8 and attack c3, and it would actually seem that this pawn on c3 is either easier to get at than any one of my double pawns. So I think that black would be fine here. So yeah, so after queen f6, queen f3, hitting d5. So now I pretty much am obliged to go c6, which I did. I didn't feel great about that move, though, because now my bishop on d6 lacks good coverage by a piece besides the queen f6, and I really liked when the pawn's on c7 because they support each other. So I really did not want to play c6, and if you just sort of subtly notice, more of my dark squares are being weakened by this move. So keep that in mind, that these dark squares are becoming very, very sensitive, and it's just strategically very risky position for black. Bishop f4 is played, extremely logical, almost seizing on the new dark square weaknesses created by c6, and also considering posting up on this outpost on e5. And again, this is kind of the strategic problem in this position, is that white's position is just easier to play because of the entry squares on the e-file. I went rook a8 to stop a bishop e5 sighting, so at least now I'm covering the square enough times where you can't put a bishop there just yet. But now queen g3 is played, and that's a really, really strong move that, again, reinforces this bishop e5 idea. I went bishop a3 kind of panicking because I thought that positions in which I trade the bishops and trade more pieces, I'm just chronically weak on the dark squares. For instance, if I go bishop takes f4 and queen takes f4, I was wary of a situation where now this rook can come to e5. And then again, once it posts up on e5 and he has that dark square control, it's really going to be hard for me to get any life in my position when his bishop is doing a lot of work and mine is a purely defensive piece. One thing to note is I can't even trade all the rooks if I wanted to, because after the trade of everything, I drop a pawn. And these type of endgames were probably winning because of the dark squared issues that I have in my position. So really, really dodgy situation. But it actually turns out that bishop takes f4 would have been the best move. And instead, after queen takes f4, instead of playing rook takes e1, there's actually a really, really strong move here that challenges white on the dark squares in the center. Why don't you think about what that move is? All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out like what move maybe would help challenge this for the squares in the center. The move is actually c5. And this is a move that I think had been played twice in the database, not by particularly high-level players. But the point is that you actually sort of provoke a crisis in the center that actually frees up your bishop a little bit and gets you some counterplay. One potential line would be c4, trying to undermine the d5 pawn. But after c4, now you can actually trade queens. And this type of situation where you trade some pieces and your king gets involved means that this pawn weakness on f5 is not as big a deal anymore because the king's not going to get checkmated. And now black actually has prospects on the c file. So c5 would have been a really, really important move to kind of get counterplay in this position. And again, even this rook e5 move that we were concerned about before, like kind of prying open the position for or at least, you know, getting an anchor on the e5 square for white, not as dangerous anymore because after a move like rook takes e5, d takes a5, and queen e6, at least black has some control over a dark square now because he played for c5. So it's not as bad as it looks. So anyways, that was kind of a missed opportunity because I saw this potential dark square domination on e5. I panicked and thought, you know what? I need to keep my dark square bishop and get some counterplay. And that's why I went for the move bishop a3, which has the very direct and obvious threat of bishop b2, which skewers the rook on a1 and the pawn on c3. But it does kind of cede this square forever on e5, and that's going to not be a good idea. Rook takes e8 was played, and after rook takes e8, now bishop e5. And this bishop on e5 is extremely annoying and very difficult to dislodge. It's perfectly centralized. It's targeting g7. So my queen is kind of tied to the g7 pawn for now to avoid mate. It's also has the ability to eye my queen side. And most importantly, it's actually just blocking my rook on the one open file. So the bishop is just phenomenal on that square, and it makes it very, very difficult to get any active play. And so, again, you can see why actually getting rid of that bishop was actually very important when I had the opportunity, because now it's just a total monster. Now, I saw bishop e5 and thought, okay, I'm going to go queen g6. And my point was, again, if I manage to trade the queens, the bishop on e5 is active, but with limited material, it's hard to imagine he could really do so much with it. But the issue is that it's not so easy to trade queens, and white just said, no, we're not going to trade queens, and went queen h3. And this is a good move, just declining a queen trade, keeping the queens on the board, keeping it tricky, makes a lot of sense. And also keeping an eye on my f5 pawn, which is a little bit sensitive. I now had probably my last opportunity to actually try and force the queens off the board, and it would have been the better move to play than my move, and that the move I should have probably played was queen g4. Because if I really want the queens off the board now, this trade would be optimal for me. These double pawns aren't a huge issue. This g-pawn is actually restricting white's pawn structure a little bit, so he's probably going to have to push one of them to just get rid of this pesky pawn. And the flip side is that, again, I can't really be attacked so badly in endgames with the queens off. And so if he wants to keep the queens, he'd have to go queen e3. But in this position, I can actually go for f4, again, kind of provoking a crisis and trying to trade queens. And this one you can't really decline, because if you move the queen back, I have f3, which threatens mate. So after queen e3, you take this pawn, and it is a pawn sacrifice, but it's temporary because now black gets bishop b2. And after bishop b2, rook b1, bishop takes c3, you can see I've recovered my pawn, and, black is pretty much fine. One thing that's important to note here is that rook takes b7, which you think might be pretty natural, trying to stay up a pawn and sort of shattering my queen side, actually loses on the spot to rook e1 check, bishop f1, and then the very subtle bishop g4. And the point is that bishop e2 is a serious threat, just picking up the bishop. and there's no way to avoid it because the alternative of avoiding it with f3 actually leads to mate after bishop takes d4 check and rook takes f1. So actually, if I wanted to trade queens, I actually had this opportunity with queen g4, and frankly, I just missed the point that after queen e3, f4 was a good move. This was the detail I missed. I should have calculated a little bit more, and I could have seen that f4 forces the queens off, and I recover my pawn with bishop b2. Instead, I decided, you know what, maybe I have time to actually fix the double pawns that are a weakness here for a potential endgame and trade the queens later, and I decided to play b5. And b5 is actually not a bad move on the face of it. It is actually hugely beneficial that now I've actually fixed the c3 pawn as a weakness. So in potential endgames, if the queens come off the board, bishop b2 might be a very serious move. The issue, though, is that I keep the queens on, and it allows white to continue his initiative on the king side. After b5, white went for bishop e2, and I think this really perfectly highlights the opportunity that was missed, because now I don't have queen g6 I don't have queen g4 because the bishop is covering that square. And to add insult to injury, bishop e2 also threatens bishop h5, which just skewers my rook and queen. So even though I managed to get this, potential long-term gain on the queen side, it was the short-term trade I should have gone for and nullified that initiative when I had the opportunity. After bishop e2, I have to deal with this bishop h5 threat, so I decide to play rook e7, but the rook is a little bit awkwardly placed here, and it's also cutting off the bishop a little bit from retreating back. And so a better move instead of rook e7 would have been queen f7. But I must say I was reluctant to play this move because I thought after bishop h5, I didn't love that after g6 he could just move the bishop back, and this diagonal's now completely wide open and unassailable for the bishop. So I thought that at least by having a pawn on g7, he doesn't have the whole diagonal for his bishop, but it really doesn't make a difference because it's not like I can challenge the bishop with a pawn anyway. So whether it's on this pawn on g7 is on g6 or g7, it doesn't really make a huge difference. So probably should have gone queen f7. Instead, after rook e7, white went f4. And again, you can kind of just see here just how difficult it is to play black's position because white has a lot of plans now. White has this beautiful centralized bishop. White can consider, playing for g4 and getting this rook active on the g file. White might consider playing on the e file. Again, there's so many weak dark squares in my camp. It's just very, very difficult to play this position, especially because my king is just weaker than white's king. So just a tough spot to be in. Now, the other thing that f4 introduced that I had not really noticed particularly keenly is my bishop on a3 is a little bit sensitive. And so a potential c4 could make my bishop come under fire, and I think I kind of underestimated how strong this potential threat was, because if I did know it, I would have played a move like c5 or a6 or some move that considers this bishop, because the issue is that c4 is actually kind of a threat. And so because of that, because of that, I really have to deal with this particular, issue pretty much. And so because of that, I decided to go for the move a5, which I thought reinforced the bishop with b4 if c4 is played. But the issue is I overlooked that after the move c4, b4 is not such a hot idea because it actually traps my bishop. And so there were just other ways to preempt this c4 move that I kind of missed. And so really, really huge that I probably shouldn't have gone for a5. I should have gone for another move that, like a6, which reinforces my pawns a little bit better, or I don't know, even a move like c5, which also would have reinforced my bishop a little better. Because now if c4, I'd have bishop b2 hitting the rook on a1 and my pawn on d4. So I went a5, and after c4 I have a huge problem. There's a double attack on my pawn here and my bishop on a3. I went bishop b2, trying to swing my bishop around and challenge the rook on a1. And now bishop h5 is an extremely strong move, and this is kind of what I missed, because now the queen is forced to a very, very awkward spot. And I wind up going to h6 to keep an eye on this bishop on h5. But now rook b1 comes, and my position is kind of collapsing because my bishop is hanging, this pawn tension is very uncomfortable. Just a very, very difficult position to deal with. After rook b1, I went g6, trying to challenge this bishop on h5 and say, you know what, I'm going to give up my bishop on b2, but I'm going to earn a trade on the king side that'll make it opposite colored bishops and give me drawing chances. But Brian was not going for any of this and decided to play the very strong move, queen h4. And this is the move that really, really threw me for a spin, because basically he's saying, you could take my bishop, but I have queen f6 and mate, and actually, which is even worse than that, the rook on e7 is actually hanging. So basically, I have all these pieces hanging in the position, and I lack the coordination to defend them, and queen f6 is just too significant a threat. If we back up for a moment, actually, after rook b1, I did have one more try in this position, and I actually calculated this, but I did not believe it. I did not take it seriously enough that I could hold. And the move is actually the exchange sacrifice, rook takes e5. The point is that after d takes e5, I have queen takes f4. I don't have to play this check right away, because if rook takes b2, I have queen d4 check picking up the rook. So I can actually recover these central pawns and actually get a few pawns for the exchange. And so after queen takes f4, e6, bishop takes e6, this dislodges the bishop from an active post on d7 where it's protecting my pawn on b5. C takes e5, c takes b5, the line continues, queen g3, and some trades. This ending is actually possible. It's possible to fight on and even potentially hold it, because I actually have, a pawn. I have 2 pawns for the exchange, and yeah, the bishops are actually quite active. So this would have been potential to hold this one. Definitely closer to a win than a draw for black, but definitely drawing chances. Instead, after g6, my whole position is just collapsing. And so after queen h4, I went bishop a3, just trying to protect everything. I back up the bishop. I protect the e7 rook. But frankly, queen f6 is just decisive. Queen h8 is a huge, huge threat. And yeah, it's just tough sledding. I went d takes c4, just at least trying to take this pawn and maybe clearing the d5 square for my king to run to d5, but very, very unrealistic, because now white just played bishop f3, and again, the queen h8 threat is still in the cards. The rook might even come to e1 and support some attack, and these bishops are just slicing through my position with decisive effect. I went queen g7, just trying to give up an exchange and keep fighting, but losing an exchange is not seriously going to hold. And d5, which he played, is actually extremely strong, just saying, you know what, I don't have to win this rook on g7 right away. I can make more gains in the middle before I do so. If he actually took the exchange right away with bishop takes g7, I'd actually have some chances here to fight, given the fact that I have a pawn majority on the queen side. And his bishop is kind of restricted by my pawns. But after d5, which he played, the position totally opens up. And the point is, now this bishop on f3 gets a lot of scope. The main issue is that if I move my rook now to kind of save the exchange, he can play d takes c6. And not only is the material equal, he's also going to pick up b5 in a moment. And again, this pass pawn on c6 is too strong, and his bishops are just better than mine, and that's been the case actually the whole game. So couldn't really go for that. So anyways, after d5, I went c5, trying to lock up the position and trying to pretend that my 4 versus 2 on this side of the board might be a dangerous pawn mass. But Brian was very, very accurate in conversion. He started with bishop takes g7 now, just picking up the exchange. And after king takes g7, went rook e1. Really, really good move. Getting that rook active, thinking about playing d6 and rook e7 check. And notice how my bishop on a3 is cut out of the game by my pawn on c5. I went king f6 to guard against that rook e7 threat. But now he pushed forward with d6 and renewed that idea. I played b4, just trying to push those pawns. And now rook e7 anyway comes attacking the d7 bishop. And now I went bishop e6, trying to hold my piece together for a little while longer. And yeah, the position is just, not really holdable because now white played the very strong rook takes h7. And now there are essentially two major threats in the position. One of them is d7, just trying to queen that pawn. And then I'd have to give up my bishop for it. And the other in certain positions is actually bishop d5, just dislodging my bishop from protecting d7 and then pushing the next move. So really difficult to stop both those threats. I went b3 now, trying to make a pass pawn on the queen side, trying to just get my pawn majority going, because now d7 would actually be a major blunder because I could capture this one, and after rook takes a7, I'd have b takes c3 and I'd actually queen my pawn. But of course he didn't go for that. He took on b3, and after we trade a few times, I went c4, trying to get my bishop back to take this pawn. And this is a decent try. I mean, it's the only try to keep the game going because I do recover the d6 pawn. But after d7 and bishop e7, I temporarily stop it from queening, but he still has too many pawns for me stopping the d7 pawn to be a factor because he is still up the exchange. And so after b takes e4 and bishop takes d7, I've managed to stop his really active pass pawn, but he's still a pawn up and an exchange up, and it's just completely lost. Brian went bishop d5 to kind of threaten rook f7 mate, and that's a very, very alert move. And I went bishop e6, thwarting that idea, and we traded a little bit more, and then rook h8 was played. And after rook h8, I actually resigned because this rook is coming to a8. It's going to easily round up the a5 pawn. And to add insult to injury, he still has a 3 versus 2 on the king side, which is easily decisive. So there was no point in playing this position further. Really tough game. I just didn't really play well throughout. I think, I guess it's not totally fair. I played the opening decently, but the point is I didn't know much about the themes and the ideas in the opening afterward, and it was clear that my opponent knew more than me. And so that's the risk you take when you play an opening you're not super familiar with, is that you can get caught out, not because you didn't do your homework, but because you just can't know everything. And so familiarity is actually a huge factor in openings, and I definitely took that for granted here. After this game, I was now on a half out of 7. You heard that right, 0.5 out of 7, and the nightmare tournament continued. So, yeah, I was really wanting this one to end. Well, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.